Hello, friends. Welcome to the Case for Life show. We're delighted to have you with us. Our aim here is very simple. We want to equip you with powerful and persuasive pro-life arguments and give you tactics and strategies for engaging people who don't hold a biblical worldview on the topic of life. I was thinking today about how I would respond if I were on the hot seat, how I would respond today versus how I used to respond when I was younger and not as adept in dealing with these arguments that come up on the abortion issue. And one of the things I learned early on is that often when you're being grilled about your pro-life beliefs, the best thing you can do is just slow down and slow the pace of the exchange. Because what tends to happen is people start throwing a ton of stuff at you. They'll bring up things like, well, the unborn are human, but they're not persons. And you have to have consciousness to have a right to life. And why do you hate women who've been raped and need an abortion for their own mental sanity? And the list goes on and on. You've all been in these types of discussions. And I think it can be very helpful to just slow down and kind of get yourself out of attack mode. So recently, in a discussion with a stranger that I had not met, the issue of abortion came up, and his comment to me was that until you have self-awareness, there is no right to life. And I'm going to walk you through how I engage this person. Now, keep in mind, we're not in a position to talk for hours, and I modified what my goals were. I think it used to be the case I wanted to get the person to admit I was right. And I want to tell you something that almost never is going to happen. When it does, be glad, but it's a rarity. It's not something that's common occurrence. I mean, most of us, if we admit it, we don't like to admit when we've been wrong. It takes a lot of courage mentally to do that. And sometimes it takes time to process, even if you know your own position has been bested by a superior one. You got to take some time to let that settle. So what I did in this particular case was adopt a strategy of asking some questions and trying to go in the mode of understanding what my colleague was saying rather than just refute. So the issue was this. He was quite willing to grant that the unborn were human beings. He said, yeah, the science is clear. You put sperm and egg together, you've got a new living thing. He was fine with that, but on his way of thinking of this, being human was not enough. Species membership did not mean anything. What matters was personhood, and personhood is based on having self-awareness, so he alleged, and having an ability to value your existence over time. And if you don't have that capacity that's immediately exercisable, you are not yet a person. You might be a potential person, but you're not an actual person. Okay, now, I think in my earlier days, I would have immediately gone into counterexample and attack mode to show why his position did not hold up well. And there's truth in that approach, in the sense that anytime you divorce the concept of human being from human person, you're going to end up with a train wreck of counterexamples that show how untenable that position really is. But I decided to try to draw him out a little bit. So here are the questions I put to him. First of all, when he made the claim that there could be such a thing as a human that's not a person, I asked him two questions. I said, tell me why species membership does not matter. Why should we just say that being a member of the species Homo sapien is irrelevant to the question of human value? And he had not really thought of that. Again, he was just asserting these things. But if you stop to think about it, we should not so lightly dismiss the idea that species membership is irrelevant. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's just take one that comes to mind immediately. Think about a hit and run with a squirrel and a hit and run with a newborn, even a disabled newborn that is cognitively nowhere near the level of a normal newborn. Say we have a severely disabled newborn that has the cognitive ability of a calf at best. wouldn't we still consider a hit and run with that infant very differently than we would a hit and run with a squirrel? And the answer is yes. Well, why? Because we recognize at the intuitive level that species membership matters. Or as Christopher Kaiser likes to point out, we recognize there is a difference between eating a hamburger and eating a Harold burger, even if Harold's cognitive development is nowhere near that of a squirrel. We recognize there is a difference. In fact, we recognize this in our understanding of pathology. A dog that can't read is not a tragedy. A 16-year-old young woman who can't read is one. Why? Because she's failing to flourish according to her nature as a human being. It is in the nature of humans to be able to read, to be able to think cognitively, to process complex ideas. It is not in the nature of a dog to do those things. A dog can flourish according to its nature without the ability to read, without the ability to think complex thoughts, and without a cognitive awareness that the normal human has. So we recognize right away that species membership does matter. But I then asked a follow-up question. Tell me this. Have you ever met a human that wasn't a person? Have you ever met a human being that was not a person? And he didn't really have an answer to that because I kind of pressed him gently. Again, I'm not trying to do a gotcha thing here. I'm trying to get clarity and help him think more clearly about his own position. What would a human that's not a person look like? Would that be a person with Alzheimer's disease? Would that be someone with severe cognitive disabilities? Tell me what that would be. And he struggled to put his finger on what exactly that would be. So then after talking that through a little bit, I went to my second primary question, which was this. You say that we must be self-aware to have a right to life. What do you mean by self-awareness? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a crucial question to put to people. It's so easy to let people say things without defining their terms. Ask what he means by self-awareness. Did he mean actual self-awareness? Well, that would mean you cease to be a person when you sleep at night. Did he mean having the immediately exercisable capacity for self-awareness? Well, that means you'd be okay when you're sleeping, but not when they put you under for anesthesia for surgery. Did he mean having a natural capacity for self-awareness, even if you can't immediately exercise it? Well, in that case, that would protect you when you're sleeping and when you're under anesthesia, but it would also protect you if you were in a reversible coma. It would also mean that the standard fetus and embryo, which also has a natural capacity for self-awareness, would be protected. So I wanted to press him on what he meant by self-awareness to try to get greater clarity. And this is something I think it's very important for us to do as Christian ambassadors. Our job is not merely to beat people with an argument. Our real job is to help them think more deeply and do so within the perimeters of a Christian worldview. We should be ambassadors, not mere arguers. So helping people think is a matter of asking good questions that help them think more deeply. So then after we talked about what he meant by self-awareness, I asked a third primary question, and it went like this. Why is self-awareness value-giving? In other words, why is it self-awareness that gives us a right to life? Now, again, I want to point something out here that I've mentioned on a few previous episodes, but it bears repeating. Too often, we as Christians assume the burden of proof. A critic makes a claim, and right away we think, well, how do I answer that? What's my comeback? What's my 5-second rejoinder here that shuts the door on that objection? That's not the way to proceed. Take a step back and simply ask the person to defend their own assertion. The assertion is that self-awareness is what gives us value and a right to life. Well, why is that value-giving? And typically what pro-lifers do, and it's a mistake, they'll immediately punt to fetal development. They'll say, well, By week 6, we can measure brain waves. By week 11, that child is dreaming in the womb. They're having REM sleep patterns we can measure on an electroencephalogram, and yada, yada, yada. All of which are wrong answers for a very specific reason. You've just conceded the premise that self-awareness is what gives us value. I want you to challenge that premise by asking the person, again, do it politely, do it graciously, but say, tell me why you believe self-awareness is what gives us value and a right to life. Why is that decisive and not, say, for example, something else? And make them make an argument for that. Ask them for their reasons. Don't let them just make the assertion. And then I would do this. I would very gently, as a final question and a fourth question here, ask if they've seriously considered the implications of their view. For example, if we assert that self-awareness is what gives us value and a right to life, you have to understand that not only do fetuses and embryos fail that test, so do newborns. And by the way, so do toddlers. The latest research that's out there indicates that toddlers do not have a sense of self. They do not value their existence. There's no meaningful self-awareness there till almost age 3. And you don't have to take my word for this. I've been reading through the literature of several pro-abortion philosophers who make the claim that when you say that infanticide is morally permissible, you're not just allowing infanticide, you're allowing the killing of toddlers, because if self-awareness is the decisive trait, it doesn't show up at birth, it doesn't show up at age 1, it doesn't show up until later in the toddler phase. So your critic here is going to have to grapple with the fact that they're advancing an argument that allows for way more than abortion. This is something that's going to open the door logically to killing toddlers. And I would also say people who are cognitively impaired would also fall into danger here on this view. Now, I think you can also point out that not only does the argument prove too much, it has devastating impact on human equality. Ask yourself this question. In fact, you could ask your critic this question. What makes us equal? I think we all understand that our culture is obsessed with equality. We want income equality. We want marriage equality. You can marry anyone or anything you want, and we should applaud that, so the argument goes. People want social equality, and the list goes on and on. But what fundamentally makes humans equal in the first place? Is it our cognitive ability? Well, that's a problematic thing, and here's why. If cognitive ability is what gives us value and a right to life, and if that's the foundation of our equality, then those with more cognitive ability would have a greater right to life than those with less, which means university professors, perhaps politicians, maybe economists, who knows, but those in academia would have a greater right to life than those who work trade jobs, for example. The blue-collar worker would have less fundamental rights than the academic elite in our nation's most prestigious academic institutions. Well, that doesn't seem to square with our understanding of equality, does it? I mean, clearly not. But that's what follows from a belief that it's cognitive ability that gives us value and a right to life. You also run into what we call episodic problems. If cognitive ability is what gives us a right to life, having the immediately exercisable or actual ability to freely engage in cognitive ability is what gives us value and a right to life so that we can't be killed, then you literally pop in and out of existence anytime you temporarily lose that ability, then gain it back. For example, while having surgery and you're under anesthesia, or maybe you're injured and you're briefly in a coma, or you're in a deep sleep. Does that mean you go from being a person to non-person, then pop back to being one again? These are problems that follow with grounding human dignity and equality and our fundamental right to life in a trait that can come and go, that none of us share equally, and there's a better way to ground human value. And that is not to ground it in the traits that come and go, but grounded in the one thing we do share in common as human beings, and that is this: we all fundamentally share a human nature. We are all by nature human beings. Now, when you ground rights in nature rather than the immediately exercisable traits that spring from that nature, you have a more solid basis for human dignity, equality, and for saying, yeah, we have a right to life. So think for a moment, to borrow an example from my friend Stephanie Gray Connors. Imagine an amoeba on one hand and an embryo on the other. Neither is self-aware, correct? Neither is. I mean, the early embryo is not self-aware. It doesn't even have a brain yet. The amoeba is not self-aware because you rightly would say, well, amoebas by nature are not things that are self-aware. It is not in their nature to be self-aware. And you'd be quite right if you said that. But let's compare now that amoeba with the embryo. The embryo is not self-aware. The amoeba is not self-aware. But notice that in the case of the embryo, the reason why the human embryo is not yet self-aware is that it simply needs to grow and mature. The amoeba, on the other hand, will never be self-aware because it's not in its nature to be self-aware. So when we ground human dignity and human rights in a common human nature, then we get away from the trap of saying some humans are more equal and valuable than others based on the amount of a given trait that we have decided they need to have a right to life. It avoids this whole problem of savage inequality. Now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to switch gears and talk about this question. Should Christians who are Protestant and evangelical work with Catholics who identify as Christian on the issue of abortion? Should Protestants and evangelicals work with Catholics on the issue of abortion? A colleague of mine was very adamant that we should not. I'm going to give a little bit of a different answer when we come back, and I'll explain why. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everyone. Great to have you with us. Let me remind you, if you haven't done so already, please visit the site of our primary sponsor, Life Training Institute. You can see that on your screen, how to do that. At LTI, we have speakers available that can speak in schools, at your church event if you want to promote pro-life training at your church or your fellowship group. We might be able to help you with that, or help with your pregnancy center dinner. These are things we are equipped to do and would be happy to do so. All right, just before the break, I mentioned that I had had a conversation with someone who was troubled about my willingness as a Protestant to work with Catholics and others who hold a different theological view than I do, but who agree with me on the abortion issue. And I want to take a few moments to just reflect on this. Now, to be fair, there is a legitimate concern that we not cloud over, or more accurately, paper over, real differences between Protestants and Catholics. The two traditions do, in fact, differ on some things. And it's not the point of this show to talk about that, but there are differences, for example, that relate to how we each view justification, meaning how we get right with God, and, for example, where we ground ultimate authority. So those differences should not be made light of. However, the question here is, are we working together theologically to somehow present this picture that we all believe the same thing when it comes to theology? Or is our point of unity more about co-belligerence in attacking a worldview that is destructive of human value? And my view is this: when we work with Catholics, or for that matter, Jews, or Muslims, or atheists, for that example, on the issue of protecting human life legally in the womb, the purpose here is not to pretend that we agree on all worldview assumptions. We do not. However, I don't have to have agreement theologically or even across the board to be beneficial in helping save unborn lives. Imagine this. It's 1860. Slavery is ravaging the nation. And there are Catholics, there are Spiritists, there are Jews, and there are some Darwinists that are willing to work with you on abolishing the slave trade in the United States. And a group of fundamental Baptists come to you and say, well, we're not going to support that effort because you're working with people who have a different theology than we do, and shame on you for doing it. Now, if the issue were I had to give up key theological tenets of my belief to work with other people on abortion, then yeah, you're right, I'm not going to do that. But what if the point of agreement here is the outcome, not what we're putting forward as our theological foundation? And I have talked at ecumenical pro-life events for years, and I always do this. I make a joke about how, it's true. We don't all agree on everything. We have differing faith traditions here today, but we don't have to agree on everything theologically to agree morally that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings, and a just society should not sanction that. We can agree to do that. Now, again, I've gotten pushback saying, well, you have to understand the only solution to abortion is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And until the gospel is spread throughout culture, you're never going to end the abortion issue. Well, that's just false. Did we end slavery by preaching the gospel? Did we end racial segregation by preaching the gospel? Quite frankly, that claim that only preaching the gospel will end abortion is God limiting for this reason. Number one, God has given us two ways to deal with injustice. One is to change hearts through the preaching of the gospel. And I fully admit a person who has been justified by faith in Jesus will begin a process of sanctification where more and more their values line up with a biblical worldview, and they walk in deeper obedience to Christ. I totally agree with that. However, the Bible also gives a godly solution for people whose hearts won't be changed by the gospel. And that solution is found in the practice of civil law. The law is used in this case not to convert people to Christianity, though we're always glad when the law plays a role in that, and the Holy Spirit can use a lot of things to convert people, but the law's primary function is not to change the hearts, but to control the heartless. It's what Martin Luther King once said: the law can't make the white man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me, and that matters. So we see that in Scripture, really, there's two ways we can restrain evil in the culture: proclamation of the gospel, and by all means, as Christians, let's do that. And secondly, through the promotion of civil law that restrains the heartless. I also would add this, that when I work with Catholics or Jews or atheists or anybody else on the pro-life issue, why is it only a problem if I work with them on abortion, but nobody flinches if I say, hey, my business partner in my insurance agency happens to be Catholic? Nobody cares. Nobody would say to me, how dare you sell insurance with a Catholic? But wait a minute. If it's okay for me to work with Catholics selling insurance, why is it wrong for me to work with them saving lives? Now, here, I should say, in California, where I was for the last couple of weeks, as you know, there's been a series of devastating brush fires. Pacific Palisades was just wiped out by uncontrollable flames and a lack of water supply. There were other areas in Altadena near Pasadena that suffered greatly. Suppose you have a home in Pacific Palisades and the brush fires are heading your way and people on your block invite you to join them in a bucket brigade to put out the advancing flames, would you quiz your neighbor and say, well, I need to know what you believe theologically before I help you put out this fire? I mean, you'd be nuts to do that. You're going to jump in that bucket brigade, whether you're dealing with someone who holds to Islam, philosophical naturalism, Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism. It isn't going to matter. Your goal is to put out the fire. And therefore, working with people who differ from you is actually promoting human flourishing, a biblical value, by the way. It's not compromise with your theological principles. Again, it's only when you are being asked to give up your theological distinctives to work with people on a cultural issue that we run into compromise, but not when you're simply working to protect the weakest and most vulnerable amongst us. Ironically enough, though I'm often accused of working with people I don't agree with and that somehow I'm wrong for doing it, I have yet to be asked by any Catholic to surrender one little part even of my Protestant theology and distinctives to work with them on abortion. I'm never asked to do that. In fact, what I get is people showing a lot of gratitude that Protestants are willing to help them in opposing abortion, because for a lot of decades we didn't. So they are very grateful, and I'm not being pressed to give up anything I believe theologically to work with my Catholic friends on the issue of abortion. I don't have to pretend I agree with them on everything, but I can work with them to save children. That's a common co-belligerent objective we can coalesce around without compromising our theological views. I mean, another example, imagine your toddler falls into a swimming pool and the Catholic the paramedic who shows up to rescue him and resuscitate him and spare him from drowning is Catholic. Would you quiz the paramedic before you allowed him to save your child? If not, why is it okay to work with Catholics to save your child, but not okay to work with them to save someone else's child? I find these objections extremely foolish, and I wish that some pro-life Christians, principally on the evangelical side, would think a little more deeply about this. Yes, we want to be true to our theological distinctives, but we can work with others who disagree for the sake of common human flourishing, which includes the right to life to the most vulnerable, the unborn. Thank you for joining us again today. I want to remind you that if you want to dig deeper into pro-life ethics and pro-life persuasion, we have a basic level course for you. We call it Pro-Life 101, and in just 7 days, you can master the art of pro-life persuasion. You can get that at our websites. I encourage you to do that. Equip yourself to engage. Men and women, we are part of a culture that fundamentally disagrees with us on the question of human value and the question of truth, and that's not going to change if we aren't equipped to make a difference. We need to be Christ's ambassadors on these issues. I hope you'll step up and equip yourself and join us in the fight to save as many lives as we can.